Hi, I'm the List Girl and welcome to my videographic journal.
Let's go!
Today's video is going to be all things autism. I'm going to briefly explain what autism is, what the traits are, and what the autism spectrum actually looks like. Autism is a neurological disorder which affects a person's interactions, integrations, and interpretations of the world around them. This includes both the environment around them and the people around them. Autistics tend to have a hard time fitting in or feeling like they are a part of society, as there are many things that autistic people tend to disapprove of in terms of society, but also a lot of things that is misunderstood or not understood about society. They can also struggle with day-to-day activities, from something difficult to something completely mundane, which very heavily depends on that person's energy, mood, and capabilities at that moment. I myself was diagnosed by a professional at the age of 12, and thus will be using a few of my personal experiences as examples throughout this video to explain things better. Autistic traits. When it comes to autistic traits, the frequency and intensity for each trait will differ from one autistic person to another, but also when discussing one autistic person, the traits in that person will also differ depending on the day, the mood, the circumstance. That's why it's called a spectrum. As many autistic content creators tend to say, no two autistic people are the same. Once you have met one autistic person, you have met one autistic person. All of our opinions are important. Therefore, as I run through these traits, do not assume that all autistics exhibit all of these things and at the same magnitude. Trait number 1, sensory triggers. Sensory triggers can include all 5 of the senses, but each person will have their own experience and capacity. Here are a few examples of sensory triggers. When it comes to auditory senses, loud or annoying, repetitive sounds can be triggering and sometimes even painful. We as autistics, we have a hard time processing sound, especially if there are a lot of sounds going on all at once. So instead of focusing on one sound in particular and blocking out everything else that is unnecessary, our brain will focus on all of them at once and struggle to filter out what needs to be filtered out. It's sort of like we hear everything far louder than most people. So for neurotypicals, the sound of a car driving away outside of your apartment or building may not be bothersome, but for an autistic person, our brain will immediately focus on that sound. Therefore, if we are in the middle of a conversation or a work task or just anything, that sound will pull our focus away without our control. Other examples of triggering auditory sounds are fireworks, sirens, yelling, screaming, the sound of electricity, feet on concrete, someone chewing too loud, etc. Visual senses. Specific visuals can be just as disturbing as auditory triggers. A lot of visual input can also be distracting. But when it comes to things such as lights, it can cause actual pain, especially fluorescent lights. Furthermore, 1 in 4 autistic children tend to suffer from seizures and convulsions, so things such as lights can actually become a real issue. Other examples of visual triggers include large crowds or too many people, flashing lights, too much or too little color, messiness or chaos in the environment around them, etc. Next, we have touch. The touch sense can be a rather interesting one to experience, as well as some feelings being cringy or gross. Quite a few can be painful. For example, when it comes to things such as textures, I for one cannot and refuse to touch velvet. Velvet for me is not only painful, but can and has on many occasions made me throw up. It's too intense. It's too, just thinking about it. It's too much. Just velvet, and it's actually, from what I've been hearing and learning, it's actually a common trigger of many autistic people, velvet. But a funny thing about touch as an autistic is that the things that we feel on our skin lingers. This can be both a bad and a good thing. So for example, if I touch a fabric that I cannot stand, such as velvet, or if I touch something gross which puts me off completely, like someone else's dirty dish, for example, I will be suffering with that feeling for several moments, sometimes even hours after I've touched that thing, that fabric, that mess, that whatever. If I touch something horrendously disgusting, like, I don't know, the inside of a rubbish bag, I might even take several showers and the feeling will still linger to the point where I would want to rip off my own skin. It's that uncomfortable, horrible sensation, and I won't be able to focus on anything else apart from that, and potentially even trigger a panic attack. Personally, this doesn't happen too often, but for other autistic peoples, this can happen on a more frequent basis. Again, it's a spectrum, and we all react differently to different things. On the opposite of that, however, if a family member or a close friend is to give a hug, that too can linger, which is the nice side of this. This issue is the reason as to why a lot of autistics can sometimes have issues with clothing that they consider or feel to be too scratchy or too clingy. Other examples of triggers for this include too much or too little pressure, specific materials or textures. This also includes food textures and specific substances that may land on our skin. This is why some autistics struggle with water activities or being outside in the rain. Some example of smell triggers include strong foul smells, heavy chemicals, potent odors, too much or very specific perfumes or colognes can also be triggering. In terms of taste, a few examples of triggers include bland tastes or textures, but for a lot of autistics, the opposite can also be true. Food having too much texture and flavor can also be triggering. This can/will lead towards something called safe food, which is the type of food that autistic people tend to stick to and eat on a frequent basis. For example, my safe food, spaghetti and baked beans with vegan cheese on top. Weird, I know, but sometimes it's the only thing I can eat in a day, and sometimes it's the only thing I can eat in a week. For a lot of autistics, you might find, if you are related to one, you might find that they might be constantly wanting to eat chicken nugget and fries, or refuse to eat a certain type of ice cream, and they always stick to the one ice cream no matter what. A lot of autistics can struggle to experiment with different types of food. Some of them enjoy experimenting with different types of food, but can still have a safe food. In terms of like struggles when it comes to like food textures, for me, I have always, my entire life, struggled with breakfast. Either was always too dry or too soggy or too bland. I'll stick with a specific type of cereal for a couple of weeks and then get bored. I tried being healthy and have porridge every day, but it always gets so dry and it just puts me off texture-wise. So a lot of autistic people can also struggle with specific types of food, unless that will make them want to stick to their safe food. Until that food is no longer safe, which is an entire topic all on its own. In other words, we have heightened senses that are almost impossible to switch off, and thus we can become extremely sensitive to specific triggers that cause us physical pain. That physical pain will then turn into emotional pain if it persists, causing meltdowns, irritability, and complete distraction. Funny thing about sensory processing issues. However, is that a person on the spectrum can be either overstimulated or understimulated. Some autistics, like myself, can have a mixture of both. When understimulated, an autistic person will turn to a behavior called sensory seeking. This includes activities such as blasting loud music, touching specific textures that we enjoy, light play, as in flicking the light switch on and off so the lights just turn on and off repeatedly, or turning on some LED lights and watching them change. These behaviors are called stims and are self-regulatory behavior. Number 2, social skills. Social difficulties include things such as communication, sarcasm/jokes, reading faces and body language, social cues, social norms, and taking things literally. Conversations can be difficult for those on the autistic spectrum for a few reasons. Sometimes we struggle to keep the conversation going. We don't usually enjoy small talk. We overshare. A lot of the time we just want to discuss our special interests. We can take time to process what the other person has just said. We take things literally at times, which means that there may be times where jokes or sarcasm is misunderstood. When it comes to social cues and social norms, it's pretty simple. We often don't get them, and with social norms, we frequently disapprove of them. After years and years of practicing being social, we can begin to pick up on some social cues, as we can be really good at pattern recognition. That does not mean that over time we become good at reading social cues, but we have mastered the pattern of social cues. Not always though. For autistics, reading facial expressions and body language can be extremely difficult unless our special interest is psychology, and if we are obsessed with wanting to scrutinize people's behavior. Majority of the time we are lost in conversation because of our inability to read other people, which is why we tend to prefer people who are blunt, who speak their minds, who are brutally honest. Like, yes, tell me what you think. Please, do you like my company? Did I upset you? Do you hate me? Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling happy? Express yourself. We can be absolutely clueless, but we 100% want to know how the people we care about are feeling and what they are thinking. We just cannot read you. Number 3, fixations. This relates a lot to special interests, which vary from person to person. I have an entire video about special interests on my channel, which I shall link in the description box below if you are interested into looking into that further. But in short, a special interest can be anything from a specific topic, subject, activity, or hobby that someone obsesses or hyperfixates on. It frequently becomes their entire personality. A few examples of special interests include flags, dinosaurs, Legos, space, science, maths, rocks, shows, books, specific animals, etc. Examples of my personal special interests include video games, mythology, paranormal or horror, aliens, arcades, but more specifically claw machines, videography, and writing lists, hence this channel. 4, abnormal or flat speech. Some autistics can struggle with tone or pitch and thus can sound very monotone. Think of Tina Belcher from Bob's Burgers. Autistic people can also struggle with something called echolalia, which is repetition of speech, such as repeating specific words or phrases or quotes that they've heard in movies or TV shows. Scripting is also common amongst those on the spectrum. 5, other symptoms include anxiety, abnormal posture, poor eye contact, tics and fidgets, also known as stimming. Stims comprise of rocking, pacing, flapping, spinning, hand fidgets, and much more. It's also common for those on the spectrum to suffer from depression, as well as aggression, usually towards themselves, with behaviors such as headbanging, biting, lashing out in frustration, and self-harm. 6 lesser known discussed autistic traits constitute of insomnia, irregular sleeping habits, a lessened fear response, intense compassion and empathy, lack of impulse control, lack of personal space, need for routines, executive functioning issues. Around 45% of those on the spectrum can often have other learning disabilities such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dyspraxia. Frequently, people with autism can also struggle with other things such as ADHD and OCD. The actual autism spectrum. A lot of people tend to believe that the spectrum is linear, a solid line with 2 varying degrees of autism. This way of viewing the spectrum is both limiting and can be damaging. Using the terms low or high functioning undermines autistic's abilities and ignores a lot of autistic needs. As Laura Tisnik, an author and neurodivergent activist, said, the difference between high functioning autism and low functioning is that high functioning means that your deficits are ignored, and low functioning means that your assets are ignored. And so to fully understand an individual's deficits and assets, the autism spectrum had to be redesigned. If we take all of the autistic traits and put them into a chart, now you have the real autistic spectrum, based entirely off an individual's personal capabilities and difficulties, rather than whether someone is more or less autistic. It reveals the individual's needs without segregating anyone from a linear conceptual line. Person A could present on the spectrum in one way, whereas person B could present on the spectrum in a completely different way. The same goes for person C and D. All are autistic, all require different aids, but all deserve the equivalent amount of understanding. The fuller one aspect of the spectrum is, the more that specific person will struggle with that specific trait. Let's use person A's chart to break this down. Person A isn't a real person, by the way. I coloured this chart in for use of the video. But from this chart, we see that person A struggles most with fixations, sensory sensitivities, and poor eye contact. They have some difficulty with social difficulties and abnormal posture, and they have a little anxiety, tend to fidget, and at times are aggressive and have abnormal speech. They have a little bit of everything. The scale of difficulty of each trait varies, as they clearly struggle with some things more than others, but nonetheless still exhibit a little bit of everything. Attempting to put someone on a linear line of whether they are more or less autistic clearly makes no sense, when it's a case of needs and requirements rather than whether someone is more or less autistic, which is extremely unhelpful. Hi, editing Natasha. So I was really curious about what my chart looked like, because back when I was 12, I don't feel like I was never shown like how I present on the spectrum, and I don't even know if back then the spectrum looks what it looked like then, how it looks now. And so for the lols, I took the IDR Labs autism test to see what the spectrum looks like for me. And I find it really funny because right at the bottom it says your autism spectrum symptoms are very high. No shit. This is what it looks like. This is me on my worst days when I was taking the test. Like I don't feel like this every single day. Like it varies, but this is definitely me on my worst days. For sure. Yikes. If today was a bad day, for example, I would not be filming this video or even working on a video at all. My speech would definitely be lacking in enthusiasm and pitch. I'd be under the covers somewhere avoiding everyone, rewatching my favorite movie for the millionth time, probably be non-verbal, probably not eating or drinking, probably overstimulated in absolute darkness, and rather irritable. These so-called worst days come about after ignoring one's personal needs or pushing beyond one's energy capabilities. This is another reason as to why understanding what the spectrum actually looks like is so important, because understanding what an individual on the spectrum can and cannot handle helps prevent burnouts, shutdowns, and tantrums. Not only is it important for you to understand an autistic person's specific needs and requirements and what they can and cannot handle, but also the warning signs of something such as burnout or shutdown, which is a topic all on its own, and I will be making a video covering it. Personally, my warning signs that I'm about to burn out or shut down can either occur abruptly or slowly over time. For example, my room could be progressively getting messier and messier, which isn't my normal state of being. My ability to hold a conversation could progressively diminish. I would probably be getting more and more frustrated at little things, especially with sensory triggers, with things such as sounds and bright lights. Nonetheless, these warning signs could be different and will be different for a lot of other autistic people, and another autistic person's worst day will look completely different to my worst day. A note/hint: when you notice an autistic person's difficulties presenting themselves more and more, this is the time for stimming and taking part in your special interest in order to self-regulate and recharge before complete burnout. So if you yourself are an autistic person, have an autistic loved one in your family, or are friends with an autistic person, get to learn their triggers, get to learn their warning signs. And once you know those things, be understanding, patient, and maybe even push them, remind them that it's probably time for self-care. If you would like me to get more specific about certain autistic traits, terms, aspects, see my playlist all about everything autistic. I am the List Girl, and just before I log off, I have just one question for you. What is your next adventure?